On the 21st of June 1898, thousands of people had gathered on the banks of Bow Creek, where I'm stood right now, to see the launch of a pre-dreadnought battleship. What followed was not only one of the worst disasters to happen on the Thames, but it was also one of the first disasters to ever be recorded live on video. I'm going to see how close I can get to where it was actually launched. This is the tragic launch. DLR. This is the tragic launch of HMS Albion.
So first things first, we should probably talk a little bit about ship launches, because today they're, shall we say, somewhat less of a draw for big crowds. But in the late 1800s, that certainly wasn't the case, and the launching of a brand new ship, especially something as exciting as a battleship, was certain to draw massive crowds. So they were something of a spectacle, which meant that a lot of shipyards and shipbuilders put a lot of stock in the success of a launch. And launching a ship is not always the most straightforward of things. And most of us would probably think, well, it's a boat. You design a boat to float in water, you're putting it in water, it's probably going to be fine, right? But that's not always been the case. Lots of things had to be taken into account. Weight of the hull had to be really precisely measured and perfectly balanced. The slipways the ship was going to be launching off of had to be constructed really carefully to be able to support that huge weight. You also had to make sure that the ship didn't get stuck on a slipway as it was being guided into the water. So slipways had to be, a little bit greasy, and I say a little bit, they had to be very greasy to allow for that ship to slide seamlessly down into the water. Then they had to take into account things like the tides, how predictable was the weather going to be at the time of the launch, and obviously we're talking about the 1800s here, albeit the late 1800s. We still can't precisely predict the weather now, let alone then. So there was a lot going on when it came to launching a huge ship. And one earlier bad example in 1883 was the launch of the Daphne on the River Clyde. The Daphne was a 450-ton steam packet, and it capsized almost immediately after hitting the water, drowning 124 workmen and boys. And in that situation, they'd miscalculated a number of those important things that we were just talking about. So, with the launch of a ship, there were many things to take into account, and for a lot of the people involved, the successful launch of a huge ship in front of huge crowds of people was a huge relief, and the result of years of building and planning. Which brings us to HMS Albion.
I am officially at Bow Creek. It's a beautiful day, but it's a bit desolate around here. And I'm walking this way because I'm pretty sure on this side of the river is where the Albion was launched. What I don't know is whether I can actually get to where it was launched from. And I think I'm already seeing some bad signs. Looks like a bit of a shithole. Well, we'll go as far as we can. I know it's summer, it's hot, so the water levels aren't quite what they are, during the other periods of the year, but there's no way this river is taking a pre-dreadnought battleship right now. Yeah, I'm not going to get much further this way. Sorry to interrupt the video on this beautiful day in East London Cemetery, but it would really help me if you're enjoying the video so far, if you gave it a like, left a comment if you have something interesting to say, and subscribe to my channel because that really helps me out. Every new subscriber helps encourage me to keep going out and doing these because it's nice to know people are watching. Anyway, back to the Albion.
Albion was a Canopus-class battleship, and as I mentioned at the beginning, she was one of the pre-dreadnought battleships, a series of ships that by the time World War I came around became something of an afterthought. But during the years from their construction to the beginning of World War I, these were something that Britain and Britain's shipbuilders took great pride in. She was built at Thames Ironworks and Shipbuilding Company in Blackwall, London, which is where I am today. She displaced over 13,000 tons. She was armed with 4 12-inch guns, some secondary batteries, and torpedoes. And her armour was slightly thinner than earlier ships, but that meant she was lighter and faster through the water. And by early June 1898, she was ready to be launched into the Thames. But ships launched from the Thames Ironworks weren't launched directly into the Thames. They first came down a slip onto the River Lee, or Bow Creek as we can see on this map. And they launched from the River Lee and then into the Thames, where the Lee opens up into the larger river. And ships were launched stern first, so they could essentially sail straight out into the Thames. And funnily, there's been some misconception about whether these ships were launched sideways, but that confusion has probably come from pictures and images of ships launching here. Because of how it launches from the north shore on that bend, it makes it look like it's parallel to either side of the river, when in fact it's been launched from that north shore to go straight out into the Thames. However, what that did mean was that when these ships were launched in this manner, that they created some pretty significant launch waves, which created a significant amount of backwash. And that will become significant soon.
Now obviously, back in 1898, this area around Bow Creek and around the River Lee was pretty industrial. I mean, this is where the shipbuilding ironworks were, where Thames Ironworks were. And today, Bow Creek is looking a little bit sad. Let's just say it's a bit of a muddy shithole. Just working my way through a maze of apartment buildings. All right, well, I'm pretty sure there's really no chance that I'm going to be able to get to where the ship was launched. There's just so much that's been built up in this area, since 1898, that it's just not going to be possible. So this is going to be a case of getting as close as I possibly can. I'm basically just going to be looking for somewhere that looks like it maybe could have had a boat launched from it at some point.
It was Tuesday, the 21st of June, 1898. And the shipbuilding company were expecting a huge turnout. In fact, they'd printed 20,000 tickets for people they were expecting to arrive to watch the launch. About 40% of those were actually for people to sit on prepared wooden staging. And on top of those 20,000 people, they were also prepared for gate crashers to arrive. Like, they were happy for people to just rock up and have a look, as long as they were respectably dressed. And as expected, thousands of people gathered along the banks of the Thames and the River Lee to watch this ceremony. Thousands of men, women and children. And some of the hoi polloi were there as well. In attendance were the American ambassador, ambassadors for Turkey, Japan, the Netherlands, other notable politicians, and the plan was that the Albion was going to be launched by the Duchess of York. Also in attendance were two men armed with some of the earliest film cameras. These were E.P. Prestwich and this rather intense looking fellow here, Robert W. Paul, who was actually one of the pioneers of filmmaking, who was shooting on some of the first 35mm cameras. Prestwich had put himself in a perfect position to capture the launch, and it looked like he'd been on the roof of the company's main office looking at the stern of the Albion. On the other hand, Paul had actually taken himself to the water in a boat to get some really good close-ups of what was going on. Now, not intended for the people coming to this launch was a flimsy wooden gangway that had been set up for workers to make their way between sites at the shipbuilders' yards. It was about 100 foot in length and about 5 to 6 feet wide. And it was said that at high tide, the top of the gangway only cleared the water by about 3.5 feet. And therefore the whole thing was covered in danger signs. It was clearly only intended to be a quick way for a few workers to quickly get across one of the Bow Creek tributaries to get to where they needed to be. But on this day, a lot of people thought they'd spotted the perfect way to get the perfect view of the Albion's launch. And slightly before 3 p.m, a large crowd, including yard workers and a lot of their families, had taken up a place on this gangway. Picture a rickety wooden bridge. The police tried to clear people from the bridge, but nobody was deterred. There were simply too many people for the few police who were there to actually manage evacuating everybody off of this gangway. And apparently, one yard hand who was there to see the fruits of his labour had been overheard joking that the crowd on the bridge were about to get their annual bath. And it was not long after this that the launch began.
Over there behind me is where I was trying to get to. Now I think, looking at old maps, that used to be where the main yards were for the Thames Ironworks. So it remains to be seen whether I can get on this side of the river to where the launch was filmed from. Yeah, this overpass now goes right over where the old yards used to be, which is probably where the Albion was sitting just before she was launched. This place has just been so completely redeveloped in the last 120 odd years that It's just unrecognisable. I'm honestly going to be really lucky if I can find any trace of what used to be here, other than what's left of the Thames Ironworks, which I think is over there behind me. We'll go have a look at that in a sec. But as far as where the Albion was launched from, don't think there's anything left. I think this is unfortunately going to be a case of me pointing at a river and telling you, hey, somewhere around here this thing happened. I feel like that's what a lot of my videos are turning into. So I think, based on the camera angle that we have, the old maps, everything that I've seen, I think that just behind me is actually where the Albion was launched. It just looks completely different now. And so the ship would have been launched from just behind me here, basically with an idea to launching straight out onto the Thames.
And as the 13,000-ton hull plunged into the mouth of the River Lee, it created a massive wave. A huge surge of displaced water that swept towards both the crowded banks of the river and the crowded gangway. And within seconds, it had washed away the entire thing. Panic ensued. Up to 200 people had been immediately plunged into the horrible, writhing, muddy waters of the creek. There were cries and screams from the people who managed to get their heads above water. And a huge number of people who'd been plunged into the river were stuck wrestling with debris from the bridge, the deep, thick mud that lined the banks of the river, and the water still being displaced by the Albion, which was of course still in the water with them. The only possible positive of this happening in the way it did is that there were a large number of people who were already in the river in small boats, whose job was essentially to remove any launch debris from the water after the ship had been launched. But their job quickly turned into rescuing as many as they could, and some bystanders even jumped straight into the water to try and help whoever they could. And though they were able to rescue a majority of the people who ended up in the water, ultimately 38 people could not be saved. Most of the victims were from the East End of London, and many were from poor working class families who had come to enjoy a rare day out, and for some of the workers who were involved, a day to enjoy the fruits of their labour. What they found instead was chaos, disaster, and death. When the dust settled, it turned out that a hugely disproportionate number of the victims were women and children. And I read about one case in particular of a woman called Mrs. Isabel White, who, when she was pulled from the water, already dead, had her two daughters, Lottie and Queenie, who were aged 5 and 1, still clinging to her frock, both of them lifeless. The oldest victim that day was 64-year-old Eliza Tarbert, and the youngest was Frank Southgate, who was only 3 months old. Some who weren't killed instantly died later of pneumonia, and part of the tragedy of this is that more could probably have been saved. Because of the nature of the launch and this huge ship coming into the water, most people had been distracted or just couldn't see what was happening. And it was about 10 minutes before anyone who wasn't in the immediate vicinity of what had happened knew that anything was wrong. You have to remember the thousands of people there, the huge cheers, the hubbub of what was going on that drowned out the screams of those in the water.
We are at East London Cemetery and Crematorium, and as you can imagine, for a central London cemetery it is jam-packed here, and I was worrying a little bit about being able to find such an old memorial, but I needn't worry, I saw it as soon as I came in. I think it's safe to say they have pride of place here. I mean, from the moment you walk in, you are literally walking straight up to the memorial to those lost at the launching of the Albion. And it shows how much the local community at the time were devastated by this tragedy. You've got to remember that of the victims of this, most were women and children. This isn't a case of, a battleship going down and most of those being lost being young men. It's bad enough. This was just families who'd come out for a day of celebration to see this ship being launched with thousands of other people. And for the victims of this, that fun trip out ended here in East London Cemetery.
An inquest was held afterwards, but ultimately, no criminal charges were ever brought. Despite criticisms about unsafe crowd control and poorly built spectator platforms, the only verdict was accidental death. And in fact, some papers placed the blame solely on the victims themselves. And those included the Times. Deeply as we must all sympathise with the unfortunate people who fell victims to a natural but reckless curiosity, it must be recognised that they willfully risked their lives in spite of printed and verbal warnings, and in defiance of the regulations of the yard and of the efforts of the police to enforce them. They crossed a well-marked danger line and crowded onto a structure never meant to carry a crowd, or to withstand the rush of water caused by the launch of a great ship. In the present state of our knowledge, it does not appear that blame can fairly attach to any but themselves. But despite this outcome, Arnold Hills, one of the owners of the Thames Ironworks and Shipbuilding Company, was deeply moved by what had happened, and he made sure that the funeral expenses for the victims were met, and even provided mourning clothes for the bereaved families. He also generously contributed to a fund that had been set up by West Ham Council to help families affected. Those who'd assisted in rescuing people from the water were rewarded for their efforts. The Royal Humane Society, which had been chiefly set up to encourage public efforts at, first aid really, to help resuscitate people who had been drowned, gave out 27 silver medals. As for the Albion, she continued with her career and she saw some action later on in the Eastern Mediterranean. And ultimately the rest of her career proved pretty inconsequential. She didn't go on to be an unlucky ship, and in 1920 she was sent to the breakers. As for the films that were captured of this horrible disaster, they were controversially shown in local theatres. Obviously, despite the relative tameness of the footage now, at the time this was hugely controversial and became one of the first examples of video journalism in and around a disaster.
As sombre as it is, I always find it's quite nice coming to these central London cemeteries because you come out of the noise and grit of London and into a place of, calm serenity. In this day and age, we are so inundated with, sometimes in this 2025, live footage from war zones. And, it's constantly in the news. We're constantly being bashed over the head with that. And this is really the first example of a disaster that people saw. It wasn't just limited to the people who were there. And I'll leave it up to you to decide whether it was wrong or right to release the footage of this. Obviously, from our perspective now, it's quite tame, unless you really know what was going on behind the scenes. But obviously, this was really the start of us being so exposed to these levels of tragedies on an almost daily basis. It all kind of started here with the Albion. Well, on that note, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, like, subscribe, join my membership, all that kind of stuff. You get awesome goodies if you do that. And I'll see you in the next one.